turn with me to the reading from Isaiah chapter 10, but you might also like to keep a finger in the book of Kings, in particular 2 Kings, because we'll be turning up to a passage, 2 Kings chapter 17 in particular. And we're making our way along through this series on God and the nations. And we saw last week that the nations are not freestanding entities. There is, in fact, a spiritual power which rules over the nations. We talked about the development of the city last week. And we saw that the builder of the city, the instigator of that, was Nimrod, the mighty, mighty, mighty rebel. And he stands in the line of rebellious city builders from Cain onwards. And in that action of city building and all that it meant in terms of rebellion against God and an attempt to unseat God on the one hand and establish ourselves without the necessity of depending on God on the other hand, we see that there has in fact been behind all of that action a great and terrible spiritual power known as the devil or the serpent, the dragon. And in the book of the Revelation we saw that the city, the great city, rides on the shoulders of the beast who's made in the image of the serpent. And so we saw that all of this human activity and its construction and manifestation of all of the systems which it uses to defend itself and to preserve itself and to establish itself actually is riding on a spiritual force which rules over the nations. The nations do not realise that they are ruled over. But we said last week that there is a picture in the book of the Revelation of the woman who sits on many waters, and she rules over them and rides over them, and the many waters of the nations, we're told very clearly in Revelation chapter 17. And we saw towards the end of last week how Jesus came, the one to whom the obedience of the nations really belongs. And the question is, how is he going to rule over the nations and to defeat the power of the serpent? And how unexpected it was that he came riding in to the very heart of the city, as Jerusalem had become the embodiment, in a way, of all that opposed God. And gathered together in that place against his holy servant Jesus was Herod and Pontius Pilate and all of the Jews and the Gentiles, intent on destroying the Son of God. And yet in that very action, as he was crucified and as he prayed for those who were crucifying him, even as they were driving in the nails, "Father, forgive them, they know not what they do." Through that action of the cross, we see the power of the serpent is broken. And that's something that we're going to come back to again and again throughout this series. But what I wanted to come back to this morning is simply to assure us, on the one hand, of the simple reality of God's absolute sovereignty over the nations. And I want us to see this morning how, in the broad sweep of things, but also in the very fine detail of things, God's plan and purpose is being worked out amongst the nations, even though from our point of view so often it just seems so chaotic and so random and irrational. And to that end, we've got two examples from our two Bible readings today, one from Isaiah chapter 10 and the other from Daniel chapter 4. The Isaiah chapter 10 reading refers to Assyria. The Daniel 4 reading refers to Nebuchadnezzar and the ancient city of Babylon. Now both of these are significant because when we were looking at that chapter we called the Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10, and we saw this man Nimrod mentioned there. The beginning of his city was Babel, that is Babylon, the beginning of it, the beginning of his empire rather. And then after the scattering of the tower, he went out and he also built Nineveh. And Nineveh later became the capital of Assyria. And in the plan and purpose of God, Assyria on the one hand and Babylon on the other were both raised up by God to deal with God's Old Testament people Israel. You remember in Old Testament history how the northern tribes were taken away by Assyria, and then about 150 years later how Judah and Jerusalem were overrun by Babylon, and the exiles were taken away for 70 years. And so it's fitting, I think, that we look at these two examples because you can find their roots all the way back to Nimrod, and they play such a significant role in the history of God's Old Testament people. And even in the reading that we've had from Daniel chapter 4, you can find reference to the fact that God's sovereignty over the nations is absolute. You get Nebuchadnezzar making that statement after his period of years in the wilderness, where he's afflicted with this very strange mental condition. And he says, I see now that there is a Lord who sits in the heavens, and he does what he pleases with the kingdoms of men. And there are many other places in the scriptures we could go to which emphasize the absolute sovereignty of God over the rise and fall of nations. A little later this morning we'll be turning to Isaiah chapter 40. And in one place there in Isaiah chapter 40 verse 15, he says, the nations are like a drop in a bucket. The nations are like a speck of sand on the sea, or just a speck of dust weighed in the balance compared to God's purposes and plans. Now, when we come to look at these two examples, what we want to emphasize firstly is how God has brought these things about and why he has brought these things about. So in Isaiah chapter 10, we read, woe to those who enact evil statutes. And the woe there is not to Assyria nor to Babylon, but the woe is in fact to God's own Old Testament people Israel. And he says in the opening section of Isaiah chapter 10 that this nation is a godless nation. Now, it's not godless in the sense that we might think of a secular godless state. It was godless in the sense that it had given itself over to idolatry. So Israel in the north, and to a lesser extent and in a different way, Judah in the south, had become infested with false worship, infested with idolatry in various forms. So it wasn't godless in the sense that there were no gods in the land. But what do we know from the scriptures except that there is only one God, the maker of heaven and earth? And all of the other so-called gods are in fact not gods. They are the works of men's hands, and we invest something in them and then they become a spiritual power, and demonic forces latch on to the fact that men invest something in the worship of an idol or an image they've made, but the thing itself is not a god. So when he says they're a godless nation, it was not as though they were a secular state. They were in fact just entirely idolatrous, and in that sense they had rejected the only true God and exchanged him for those things which were not gods. So in a real sense they were godless, even though they were full of gods, if we could put it that way. The more gods they had, the more godless they really were. And this nation, God's own people, because they were a covenant nation, knew that in exchanging God for a lie, and exchanging the true God, the one and only God, the creator of heaven and earth, for the idols which were no gods and which could not give life, that in that they were transgressing the covenant, and they would reap the harvest of the curse of the broken covenant. And God raises up Assyria in order to bring that broken covenant curse about. The reason for it is expressed clearly in 2 Kings. 2 Kings chapter 17. Verse 5. The king of Assyria invaded the whole land and went up to Samaria and besieged it for 3 years. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and carried Israel away into exile to Assyria and settled them in Hala and Habor and so forth. Verse 7. This is the explanation. Now this came about because the sons of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up from the land of Egypt under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and they had served other gods. And they had walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord had driven out before the sons of Israel. So the general principle is the judgment has come because they have exchanged the worship of God for the worship of idols. And then there's a specific list of the things that exchange meant. We won't go through them all, but just run your eye down verse 9. They built for themselves high places. Verse 10, they set sacred pillars and asherim. Verse 11, they burned incense in the hill places. Verse 12, they served idols. Yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah, verse 13, yet they did not listen, verse 14. Verse 15, they rejected his laws. Verse 16, they forsook all the commandments, made molten images, and then verse 17, made their sons and daughters pass through the fire, meaning they burnt their children alive as an offering to the gods. They practiced divination and enchantments and sold themselves to do evil. This is not a nation which is just drifting along a meandering and innocent course. It's actually changed the truth of God for a lie in an act of consistent and dedicated rebellion. So God raises up Assyria. And if we go to the reading in Isaiah chapter 10, you find that the description of God's actions in raising up Assyria is very direct. Verse 5. Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger, and the staff in whose hands is my indignation. I send it. I send it. Get that? I send it against a godless nation. Assyria just didn't happen to be on the scene. It's no accidental occurrence that Assyria was Assyria at the time that Assyria was Assyria. I send it against a godless nation. I commission it. I command it. I appoint it against the people of my fury. You go across to verse 12. So it will be when the Lord has completed all of his work on Mount Zion and on Jerusalem, he will say. What work is he talking about? He's talking about the work of sending Assyria in judgment against Israel. Verse 15 is the axe to boast itself over the one who chops with it, meaning there is one who's wielding this nation, Assyria. So you can't read those verses and come to the conclusion that Assyria's rise and Assyria's power was simply an accident of history, and it just happened to be that they were the ones that took Israel away into captivity. God claims his sovereignty over the nations completely. But, you'll notice, he says, I send Assyria against a godless nation, and I'm using Assyria to judge that godless nation. But Assyria, for its own part, engages in that action with deep hostility, with haughtiness of spirit, with proud arrogance, and because of that, I will judge the haughty heart of the king of Assyria. In other words, the actions that Assyria are called to do are actions which they are also accountable for. And Assyria boasts in its strength and its power, and it says, because of my might, because of the strength of my arm, because of the military power that I have and the political prestige and all of the other things that I trust in, because of my power in the city, if we could talk about it in last week's terms, because of all of that I can do this, and I can just do what I want even with Israel and even with Judah. And God says, no, you can't do just what you want with them. You can only do what you're allowed to do, and at this point you're allowed to do something which is a terrible action of judgment. But you should recognise that this power, even to do that, is not from within your own heart. It's not from within your own manifestation of strength. God has actually given you this to do, and I will punish the arrogant heart of the king of Assyria because he does not acknowledge me in any of his actions. He does not show mercy in the way he brings his judgment, and he boasts amongst the nations of what he's going to do and how he's going to do it. And you get this remarkable picture there of him just reaching in as someone might reach into a bird's nest and plucking out the eggs or plucking out the birds or plucking out the chicks. And he says, no one can stop me. I can do whatever I like. So the actions of Assyria are under the hand of God, both in the sense that Assyria is sent to judge, but also in the sense that Assyria itself will be judged. The second example from Daniel chapter 4 is similar. We won't go through it all now. We'll come back to some of those passages later in the series. But you'll remember that Nebuchadnezzar had this very troubling dream. No one could interpret it, of a tree which was going to be cut down. But the tree was one which was magnificent in its size, and all of the nations, it was so great that all of the nations could shelter under its boughs. And Daniel is given the interpretation of the dream, and he's rather fearful about speaking that interpretation. And the king says to him, no, tell out all the interpretation. And he says, well, O great king, the tree is you. And God's made you a great tree. And God's made you a place where all the nations are gathered. The Babylonian Empire was the biggest one the world had seen up until that point. But you have been arrogant in your heart. And you've strode throughout the nations, and you have thought that because of your own power and ability, because of your own strategic planning and military might, you've been able to accomplish these things. Now it's been given to you from the Lord of heaven, and you've not acknowledged him. And there'll be a season where everything's going to go pear-shaped, to say the least. And you're going to be driven away from the face of men, and you're going to wander out in the wilderness for 7 years, and you're going to have a very weird and unusual experience of being mentally dislocated. And you're going to become as an animal rather than a man. And at the end of that period, you will return and you'll come to your senses. And when you come to your senses, what will you know? That you are not the king of the earth. But you will know that there is one who appoints the kings of the earth. And if you're a king of the earth, you had better bow the knee before the one who appoints the kings of the earth. And at the end of that passage that we read, he praises the Lord of heaven because he's come to see that all of the things that Daniel had said were in fact true. And again, Babylon was raised up. It was commissioned to take away Judah into captivity. The prophets prophesied its coming. But Babylon was not left to stand because of Babylon's mistreatment of its enemies. Babylon itself was judged. God raised up someone else called Cyrus. We know of him in Isaiah chapter 45 and other places. And this man is said to be my shepherd, my servant, my anointed one. So when we look at those examples and many, many others, you could see there is no sovereignty of the nations, even if the nations are ruled over by the city who rides on the shoulders of the beast, who stands on the shore in the image of the Antichrist, they are still not freestanding agents. God still rules over all of that. And he raises them up as he wills. He causes them to fall as he wills. Now that leads us to a question then. Is there any rhyme or reason to the rising and the falling? And the response to that, I think, is that we have to say that when we look at the Scriptures, there is no just random action that God's engaged in. Everything is purposive. Everything is done according to a predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God. These are not random actions, and we can see them as not being random in at least two ways. In at least two ways. Firstly, every action of God in dealing with the nations from the fall of man onwards has been with a view to the preparation of the coming of his Son. Israel had to be Israel. Israel had to go through what Israel went through. Assyria had to be Assyria. Babylon had to be Babylon. Rome had to be Rome, so that in Galatians chapter 4, verse 4 and following, it says, when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order that he might redeem those who are under the law. Now, when the fullness of time, what does that mean? When the time had fully come. It means when God had finished all that he needed to do to have the situation just as it was, so that when Christ came, the Pharisees were the Pharisees, and Simon Peter was Simon Peter, and Caiaphas was Caiaphas, and Herod was Herod, and Pilate was Pilate, and Rome was Rome, and Caesar Augustus sends out a decree. All of that whole action, which we would just look at and think, oh, it's random action. Caiaphas is raised up because he's been able to pay the bribes that are necessary to get to the high priest position. Pilate's there manoeuvring away politically to get himself into a position where he can win further favour with Rome. Caesar Augustus is there because of all of the machinations that have gone amongst the Roman emperors to get him into the position where he is. No, it's the fullness of time. God doesn't sit back and say, well, I'll just let it all happen, let it unfold, and perhaps if there's just the slightest opportunity, I might be able to just sort of slip my Son in there at some point that might be convenient. He's actually purposed, planned the whole thing so that everything from the fall onwards, the rise and fall of all of the nations in their sequence, has led to the point where the Son could come at the fullness of time, where he could be crucified in the hands of godless men in Jerusalem at that point, where Rome later could be used to bring judgment on Jerusalem 70 years later. Nothing of all of that was simply accidental. It was all with a view to the coming of the Son. So gathered together against this city, against Herod and Pontius, against your servant Jesus, was Herod and Pontius Pilate and all the Jews, to do whatever your hand and purpose, predestined to occur. Now that should give us great heart. I don't want us to hear that word and think, well, how do I process that metaphysically or philosophically, and what about human responsibility and free will and divine... That's not the question. None of those questions actually are the question. The question is, do we live by faith in a God who prepares everything for the coming of his Son, and do we hear the word of the Son when he comes? And what is God doing now amongst the nations? Well, are many things which we will come to as the series unfolds. But we could say very simply that just as God was preparing the nations for the coming of the Son, so he is preparing the nations for the return of the Son. The history that we see unfolding is not a history of just random action of rulers who take their own authority. Finally, this is all heading to a point where the Son of Heaven, the Son will appear from heaven. And at that point, we will see why everything has needed to be the way it is, and the timing of everything has had to be the timing that it is, in order that, in the fullness of the full times, the great goal, the great telos, the great end point of all history would be reached. So we're not here by random action this morning. Those who are visiting with us are not here by random action. The movements that have taken us to the nations and the nations to us, and we, where we are in our nation, and the nations around us where they are in their action, all of that is as much purposeful as it was in the fullness of times for the first coming, if I could put it that way. But the second way in which the action of God amongst the nations is not random is this: that God's dealings with the nations are fully in accordance with his own moral character. Now, some years ago, I was given a book, or put onto a book, by a fellow who was called Harry Lacey. The book was called God and the Nations. I don't know if any of you have ever seen it. It was written in the early 1940s. And it was not a speculative book at all. You know how some books try and work out prophetic schemes and which nation is which nation and what does that mean for so-and-so and the rise of Russia and the fall of communism and all that. It's not speculative like that at all. It's just a book which traces through the way in which God deals with the nations in the Scriptures. And what Harry Lacey did in that book was to go through the things which nations did in the Bible, which nations did what things, and also to say what was God's response. And I don't have an exhaustive list of what he's got, but he says, amongst other things, these, and there's lots of chapter and verse references which we won't go to, he says, these are the sorts of things which God brings judgment upon a nation for, or other nations: provoking a quarrel with a neighbouring nation, using unprincipled means of expansion, perpetrating atrocities in warfare, being merciless in warfare, taking pride in national security, being antagonistic towards God's own people, showing no pity for a fallen nation, taking pride in wealth, failure to recognise God's authority over the nations, refusal to hear the prophets, idolatry, astrology, witchcraft, sorcery and the like, unthankfulness, greed, unprincipled trade, and immorality of various sorts, to just name just a few. These are all things that does any of that look anything like our newspapers? And when the nations are given over to these things, the prophets, not least Amos, where they prophesies the rise and fall of, is it 6 or 8 nations? They all relate to what nations are doing in relationship to these things, and if you trace those back, they all relate to what the nations are doing to the law of God. And then bearing in mind that this comment was written, the book was published in 1942. So the comment was written probably a year or two before that, before the tide of the war in Europe had turned, when Hitler was just on the rampage and nations were toppling over like dominoes. This is what, on the basis of this analysis, he just makes this throwaway comment. He doesn't name Hitler by name, but he calls him the rod of Europe, that is the one bringing discipline and judgment. The rod of Europe seems to have been paid in spoil. That is because they've got all of the wealth of the nations flowing into Berlin. The rod of Europe seems to have been paid in spoil for his service upon not a few guilty nations. Interesting statement, isn't it? But surely as this is true, he will in due course be paid for his sins. Now that's a statement of faith, isn't it? Before the tide of the war's turned, when everything seems as though the rod of Europe is going to triumph and only he will triumph, he said, no, you look at the scriptures, you see what he's done. He's a bit like Assyria. He'll be judged. And so I think we need to take enormous hope and insurance. No, we don't need to take that. Enormous hope and assurance from these things. And not just as we look at the great scheme of history and the great and tumultuous events that take place amongst the nations, but just think about the detail behind that. What did it mean? What level of detail had to be there for Daniel to be Daniel and speak to Nebuchadnezzar? How much purpose and planning, if I can put it that way, human way of speaking, had to be there for Joseph to be Joseph in Egypt, for Cyrus to be Cyrus, for any of God's people to be in any situation, and to know that you are there by the express purpose of God. We should just take enormous assurance from these things and to commend ourselves to a faithful Creator, as Peter says. But the thing that I want to close on in these last couple of minutes is this. It's something we mentioned last week and we'll come back to again and again. What is the purpose of God's dealing with these nations and having us amongst them and having his people scattered throughout them? And what is the purpose in God sending his Son to come to the very heart of the nations and to there be crucified in the city of Jerusalem? Is it not this, that God's purpose is that his nations will be blessed? That his nations will be blessed. So God sends Jonah to Nineveh, of all places, the capital of Assyria. And what's Jonah's response? I don't want to go there. Why? Because you're just the sort of God who, if I preach to them, they will be healed and they will turn and repent and you'll bless them. And I don't want my enemies to be blessed. So I'm not going. I'll find a ship that goes in the other direction. But what's the heart of God behind that? There's a whole story that God has to do with the angry heart of Jonah, and the contrast is finally between the angry heart of Jonah and the compassionate heart of God towards his enemies, to go out and do them good and to bless them. And why is it that he sends Joseph in the midst of Egypt? And why is it that he sends Daniel in the midst of Babylon? If you may still have Isaiah open, turn to Isaiah chapter 19. There are two great figures of Egypt and Assyria who represent in different ways the oppression of God's people. Egypt as the oppressor of God's people during the exile, Assyria as the oppressor of God's people, Egypt as the oppressor of God's people before the Exodus rather, and Assyria as the oppressor of God's people as they're taken away into captivity. Have a look at chapter 19, verse 19. In that day, the day of the Lord, there will be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar to the Lord near its border. It will become a sign and a witness that the Lord of hosts in the land of Egypt, for they will cry to the Lord because of their oppressors. And he will send them a saviour and a champion, and he will deliver them. Thus the Lord will make himself known to Egypt. The Egyptians will know the Lord in that day. They'll even worship with sacrifice and offering, and will make a vow to the Lord and perform it. The Lord will strike Egypt, striking for their healing, so that they will return to the Lord, and he'll respond to them and heal them. In that day there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria, and the Assyrians will come to Egypt, and the Egyptians to the Assyrians, and the Egyptians will worship with the Assyrians. In that day Israel will be a third part with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the earth, whom the Lord of hosts has blessed. And look at what he says, saying, blessed is Egypt, my people. It's exactly the same word used of Israel. And Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my inheritance. And what is it in the heart of God that looks at the two worst oppressors of his people and says, I'm going to love them so much that they will be one with my people, that my enemies will be so subdued before me that the very ones who have shed the blood of my people in slavery will actually stand with my people and share with the inheritance of my people. What sort of compassion is there in God for the nations? Egypt and Assyria at that point represent the fullness of the Gentiles coming in, as God takes down the dividing wall of hostility, and he makes one new man. Our time's gone this morning, but if we had time, we would run through a few verses. Flip across to Isaiah chapter 40 as we come to close. You have this great and remarkable picture of comfort. Comfort, O comfort my people, says the Lord God. Speak kindly to Jerusalem. And there's voice calling out to proclaim good news. Verse 9, they are to get up on a high mountain. And what are they to proclaim? Here is the Lord who's coming, verse 10, with might and his arm ruling for him. And how is he coming? Verse 11, like a shepherd he comes to tend his flock. In his arm he will gather the lambs and carry them in his bosom. He'll gently lead the nursing ewes. And is he thinking about you? No pun intended, or me? As you read through Isaiah 40 and 42 and 43 and on and on and on to chapter 66, he's come to shepherd the nations. Remember what Jesus says in John chapter 10, I have other sheep who are not of this fold, meaning other nations. And as he comes, verse 42, chapter 42, verse 1, behold my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He'll bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry out and raise his voice, nor will he make his voice heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break. A dimly burning wick he will not extinguish, but he will bring forth the Lord's justice. He'll not be disheartened or crushed until he's established justice in the earth. And the coastlands, who are those? Japheth's people, right on the very fringes, the uttermost parts, wait expectantly for his law. And as you go through 45, 46, 47, what's this one doing? Come to 43. No, 53. Back at the end of 52. Behold, my servant will prosper, 52 verse 13. He will be high and lifted up and greatly exalted. Just as many were astonished at you, my people, so his appearance was marred more than any man, his form more than the sons of men. Thus he will sprinkle many nations. How's he going to bring forth justice to the ends of the earth? He's going to sprinkle them with his blood. Kings will shut their mouths on account of him. For what had not been told them they will see, what they had not heard they will understand. So he's crucified in the midst of the transgressors. He's hung on a cross at the hands of the nations, amidst the nations. But as he's doing that, he's actually cleansing the nations by his blood. So he's poured himself out for their death. Verse 11, as a result of the anguish of his soul, he will see it and be satisfied, and by his knowledge the righteous one will justify the many. In Isaiah chapter 49, verse 6, we won't turn to it now, it just says simply, it's too light a thing that I should raise up my servant to bless Israel. That's too small a thing and too mean a thing for me to do. It's too light a thing that I should give my son for my own people. It's a much more wonderful thing that I should give my son for the sins of the world. It's too light a thing that I should abandon up my son for my own people alone. It's too wonderful a thing to hold back. So he is the one through whom the nations are sprinkled, beloved. He loves the nations. He loves the nations who are in rebellion against him. Beloved, he loves you and me in our rebellion against him. And by his blood he has sprinkled us, has he not? And he's brought forth his justice in our hearts. And because of that we love him, do we not? Amen. Our time's gone. We're going